Hi, students. Welcome back. Okay, so today we're talking about the elements of culture. We're making a list of the different parts of culture because a lot of times when people talk about culture, it gets kind of vague as to exactly what they're talking about, right? Have you noticed that? Like, oh, that's the culture where they live. But what do you actually mean by culture? By breaking it down into smaller parts, we can kind of start to see what we mean when we use that word culture. Okay, also another cool thing about this lecture is what we're going to see is remember when we talked about theory, we talked about that idea called hegemony. Hegemony is the coercive force of culture. Today we're going to kind of explore what is that force and how does it work. It's actually kind of a little social mechanism to push on us and make us behave in ways we might not otherwise. Okay, let's get started. What's the first element of culture? It is objects. Yay! Okay, so objects, that means just like all the stuff that we're familiar with in our culture. So like you all know this is a whiteboard marker and you should use it on a whiteboard. If you try to use it on paper, it's kind of not very good. You know that this stuff wipes off very easily, right? Because that's a whiteboard marker and a whiteboard. You know this is a shirt. You know these are glasses. Have you ever gone somewhere like to a different culture and they probably have a lot of objects and you don't know what they are? It's a little disorienting. It makes you feel like, ooh, I don't know. It can be frightening even if you don't know what all the cultural objects are. We're actually really comfy and cozy in our culture because we're so familiar with all of the objects around us and we know what they are and we know what they do, and it makes things run really smoothly. Okay, so what's the second element of culture? That's language. Now, by language, I mean verbal and nonverbal. So, for example, I flap my arms around. I'm sure you guys have started to note this. I get so excited. I love sociology. Okay, so I flap my arms around. In our culture, that's totally okay. In other cultures, I would be considered very rude for all the arm flapping that I do. Have you guys noticed I say a lot? I can't stop myself. But you know that that's okay. You're familiar with our culture and you know that is just like, oh, she needs a minute to think, right? I also stumble on my words sometimes. And in our culture, you know, like, oh, she's just stumbling on a word. I know what word she means. I'm just going to wait patiently while she gets there, right? Okay. Language is also really subjective to our cultures as well, right? Like we know that if we say certain things, that it has a very specific meaning. I was thinking about like a lot of hip language right now, like I don't know, like texting talk or stuff teenagers are doing, right? Where like it's not like 20 years ago that would have meant anything like LOL. And now we all know what LOL means. Actually, my mom didn't know what LOL meant. It was really funny. She thought it meant loads of love. So like somebody was sick and in the hospital and my mom texted like, love you kids, LOL. And we were like, what do you mean? So somebody had to tell her it means laugh out loud, not loads of love. But most people are kind of familiar with the language and we know what words mean and what the sentiment along with those words mean. For example, when you say LOL, how often are you really LOLing? Not very often, right? But it's just kind of a way to say like, I think you're funny, right? But you don't have to actually laugh out loud. Rarely do you probably actually laugh out loud, right? Oh, the exclamation mark. So interesting right now with all the texting, it's hard to convey your emotions. And so everybody's using the exclamation mark. And it's just a way to say like, I'm excited, I'm happy, right? Instead of like, my daughter gave me a hard time because I was always using proper punctuation in my text. And she's like, Mom, you seem so angry. And so I was like, oh, I better add some exclamation marks so I seem happy again, right? Okay, so all of this knowledge about language leads to a cultural identity, right? Where we all kind of share that information about the words we use and the nonverbal expressions that we use as well. Okay, the next element of culture is norms. I hope you'll remember from the very beginning of the semester, I told you that norms, real easy definition, just rules for behavior. I'll write it up here so we remember. Rules for behavior. There are so many norms guiding our daily life, right? Like, oh, there was an did you hear it? Like the way that we walk, the way that we interact with other people, stopping at a stop sign, the way that we dress, the way that we style ourselves, all of these things. So much the way that we eat, the products that we choose, all of this is created through normative behavior, those rules for our behavior. There are a couple different types of norms. The first type tells you basically whether a norm is written or unwritten. So an informal norm is one that's not written. A formal norm is one that is written. Okay, so like the speed limit sign on the side of the road, that's a formal norm. It says, hey buddy, you can only go 55 miles per hour. Even though the informal norm is we all know that you can go 5 over, right? So even though the speed sign, the formal norm says 55 miles per hour, all of us are going at least 60 miles per hour because that's the informal norm. It's not written, right? Like you can't look in the Colorado Penal Code and it says, well, the speed limit is going to be 55, but you can actually go 5 over, right? Like it's nowhere written, but we all just know that's the way to go, right? Okay, but that doesn't really tell us how important a norm is, right? Like whether it's written or it's not written. For example, I feel like going 5 over is pretty important, and I get frustrated when people don't do it, right? So that's not telling us whether it's important or not. The way that we tell if a norm is important is the difference between mores and folkways. Okay, mores, I better write that down, huh? That's a big word. Mores. Mores are norms that are deemed necessary for the functioning of society. So we need those norms. Society won't really work if we don't have those norms. Folkways, on the other hand, are just rules for everyday behavior. So like chew with your mouth shut, hold the door for somebody, things like that. Society won't crumble if we don't follow those, but gee, it's nice if you just would, right? That's the difference between mores. An example of a more would be like murder. If all of a sudden you can just murder whoever you want, society's gonna get tricky, right? On the other hand, if all of a sudden tomorrow you don't have to hold doors for people, I mean, it might be a little sad, but society's going to stick together. Everything will be mostly fine if we do that one. Okay, so that tells us how important a norm is. But have you ever wondered, why do we follow the norms, right? Like there's all these rules for our behavior. Why are we following them? Why don't we just say like, YOLO, I'm not going to do that anymore? The reason is sanctions, which is our fourth element of society. Sanctions are the rewards or the punishments regarding a norm. So whether or not you follow the norm, you either get a reward or you get a punishment. So for example, oh, that's why doing these YouTubes is so tricky, right? Because in class, I say all these funny things and then people smile at me and I'm like, oh, I gotta keep being funny. And it really it works. We work with each other. Here on YouTube, I have no audience, so I just lay these lame ass jokes out and I hope you're laughing at home. I know you're not. It's okay. It's fine. All right. But also you can have negative sanctions too. So for example, when I have those brain farts in class and I'm like, and I can't think, my students glare at me and I'm like, oh man, Holly, you got to get your shit together. No more mess ups, right? So these sanctions kind of push our behavior. How many of you have been late? Since we were talking about driving, you've been late, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be late. And you want to speed, right? And then you're like, but I don't have an extra $100. So you back off, right? And then you're like, oh, I'm going to be late. And then you're like, no, don't speed, right? That fear of a ticket is a sanction, right? Like, yes, you're late and you'd love to go fast, but you're not going to go super fast because you don't have the money to pay for a ticket. The ticket is sort of driving whether or not you follow the norm. Now, the tricky part about all of this is knowing exactly the sanction that'll get the behavior that we want. It's not like there's some perfect mathematical formula where we're like, oh, this is exactly going to get people to conform. A lot of people have different thresholds, right? Have you ever you just came in with some money or something, or you just got a new job and you're like, I'm gonna speed today because I don't care if I get a ticket, right? You go real fast. And then maybe another time, like you're having a hard time paying your bills and things are really tight money wise, and you're like, oh, I'm going exactly the speed limit. I can't. So the threshold for whether we actually care about the sanction or whether the sanction is motivating our behavior is different for every person, and even for individuals, it can change over time. It makes sanctions really tricky, right? Okay, so why do we feel justified in creating these sanctions to get people to follow the norms? That is our values. Our last element of culture is values. Values are just our ideas about what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong, right? So, for example, running a stoplight, right? That's a bad thing to do, right? Most people agree. Like if you just straight out run right through a red light, that is a very arrogant, that can cause damage. That's a bad thing to do. Our value says no, that's not good. And therefore we create pretty serious sanctions if you do that, right? It's not just a little $100 ticket that you're gonna pay off at municipal court. It's a big deal if you straight out like run through a red light. And so a lot of people don't do that, right? They're pretty controlled by that norm because the values justify it, the sanctions are strong, and so most people aren't going to do that. Now, then on the other hand, what about the people, I've noticed it a lot lately, squeaking through on a red at the end of a yellow. So it's not like you're just blazing through when it's red, but you're squeaking through at the end. There, I think the values differ a little bit. We don't really see that as so bad. It's a little annoying if you're on the other side of it, right? You're like, oh, that jerk, right? He ran a red light. But we don't feel real strongly about it. Therefore, we don't have really strong sanctions for it. I was at an intersection the other day and a police officer watched somebody do that, right? Where they missed the yellow. It was all red, but the officer didn't stop them, right? Which means that people are more likely to do it because the sanction isn't very strong, because the value isn't really strong there either. And so this is that social mechanism that I was talking about, right? That we have to have the value, the idea about whether something's good or bad or right or wrong, and that has to drive the sanction. That tells us it's okay. Have you guys ever been in a situation where somebody sanctioned you improperly? Like, I was somewhere recently and this lady was just so mean to me, and I was only asking like for a little bit of help, right? She was so mean, and I thought like, whoa, she is not sanctioning me properly. She should have said like, well, here's your choices, right? But to just attack me like that, I was like, whoa, you have the sanction wrong in this situation. So we actually have a lot of knowledge and a lot of leeway that we engage in on sanctions. But the sanctions then drive the norm behavior. And the way that we get through this is through language and usually some use of objects. For example, I've talked a lot about money in my examples and how I don't want to pay a ticket, right? And that has a lot to do with objects. I want to have money to pay my rent, to feed my family, things like that. This is all objects. So I hope that you see after this video the cool way that culture works to kind of push us towards behaviors that we've agreed are valuable or good or maybe even bad and not good for society based on this social mechanism. All right, thanks for hanging with me, students. See you later. Bye-bye.